Welcome, dear listener. If you're just settling in for the night or simply taking a moment to relax, I'm glad you've joined me. Before we begin our journey back to the days of ancient Rome, reflecting on the brutal lives of slaves in that time, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how far our community of night owls stretches. And if you enjoy calm, immersive storytelling that brings history to life, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next tale. Now, make yourself comfortable, take a deep breath, and let your mind wander back in time with me. Close your eyes and imagine the world of ancient Rome at the height of its power and splendor. Picture magnificent marble temples gleaming in the Mediterranean sun, grand colonnaded boulevards bustling with toga-clad citizens, and the famous Roman legions marching out to conquer new lands for the glory of the empire. It was a civilization of remarkable achievements in engineering, art, law, and military might. The Roman Republic and later Empire dominated the Western world for over 1,000 years, leaving a legacy that still shapes our world today. But beneath the surface of this gilded age, there was a darker side to Roman society, an aspect that is often overlooked in our popular imagination of this fascinating era. You see, the glittering achievements and lavish lifestyles of the Roman elite were only made possible by the backbreaking labor of a huge but largely invisible population, the Roman slaves. It's estimated that during the late Republican and early Imperial eras, a staggering 1 in 3 people in Italy was a slave. In the city of Rome itself, that proportion was even higher, with up to 40% of the inhabitants living in bondage. These millions of enslaved men, women, and even children toiled in wretched servitude with no rights or freedoms of their own. They were viewed as mere property, living tools that existed only to serve their masters' whims and needs. Slaves powered every aspect of the Roman economy, from agriculture to mining, construction to cottage industries, and domestic service to civic duties. But who were these slaves? Where did they come from? What were their lives really like? And how did their often forgotten stories intertwine with the titans of Roman history we still remember today? Figures like Cicero, Spartacus, and Caesar. These are the questions we'll explore together in this journey through the harrowing and little-told world of Roman slavery. It's a side of ancient Rome that's rarely depicted in the epic films or popular novels about the era, but one that profoundly shaped the Roman experience for slave and citizen alike. As we delve into the cruel realities and surprising complexities of this system, we'll meet some of the individuals, both named and nameless, who endured this existence. We'll see how slavery seeped into every corner of Roman life, and how it left an indelible mark on the empire and its successors. So, take another deep breath, and let us step back into the sandaled footsteps of the Roman slaves. Hear their stories whispered across the centuries, and remember them not just as the property and possessions we know they were reduced to, but as striving, struggling, dreaming human beings whose blood, sweat, and tears forged the world of the Romans. The sheer scale of slavery in ancient Rome is staggering to contemplate. During the late Republican and early Imperial eras, the Italian heartland of the Roman state was home to some 6 to 7 million slaves. On the peninsula of Italy, a shocking 1 in 3 people was a slave, and in the great metropolis of Rome itself, the proportion was even higher. Up to 40% of the city's inhabitants were enslaved. To put those numbers into perspective, at the height of slavery in the United States before the Civil War, around 12.5% of the population was enslaved. In ancient Rome, that percentage was more than 3 times higher. Slavery was not a peripheral phenomenon. It was woven into the very fabric of Roman society and the Roman economy. So where did all of these slaves come from? The origins of Rome's enslaved population were as diverse as the Roman world itself. Many were unfortunate captives taken as spoils of Rome's incessant wars of conquest. As Roman legions subdued new territories from Gaul to Greece, Iberia to Asia Minor, they often enslaved and deported large segments of the defeated populace. In one notorious example, when Rome finally vanquished its great North African rival Carthage in 146 BC, as many as 50,000 Carthaginians were taken prisoner and sold into slavery. Captives from military conquests formed a major pipeline of human chattel streaming back to Rome's slave markets. But not all Roman slaves were foreigners captured in battle. Many were unfortunate souls from within Roman society itself. The children of slaves automatically inherited their parents' servile status, creating an ever-expanding supply of homeborn slaves. Abandoned and unwanted infants, particularly girls, were often taken in and raised as slaves. Impoverished debtors could be sold into bondage to repay what they owed. Convicted criminals might be condemned to slavery as punishment for their misdeeds. And in the seediest corners of the empire, ruthless kidnappers snatched vulnerable provincials and even fellow citizens to sell them illicitly into servitude. All of these streams flowed into a vast slave trade that treated human beings as just another commodity to be bought, sold, and exploited. Slaves were traded from the far corners of the empire to the Roman heartland in Italy, or shuttled between Roman territories. At its peak, the Roman slave trade was a lucrative and far-reaching enterprise, with major slave markets operating in cities like Ephesus, Delos, and of course Rome itself. These markets were brutal bazaars where human souls were haggled over no differently than cattle or clothing. Slaves were assessed with humiliating scrutiny, their teeth checked, their muscles prodded, and their naked bodies examined for defects. Prices varied based on a slave's age, beauty, talents, and place of origin. A female slave from Greece, considered more refined and desirable, might sell for 2,000 sestertii, while a male labourer from Gaul could fetch half that price. But no matter where they came from or how they fell into servitude, all slaves shared the same wretched legal and social status in Roman society. In the eyes of Roman law, slaves were property, not people. They were referred to as res, things, tools animated by muscle but void of soul or personality. As the Roman jurist Gaius wrote in the 2nd century AD, slaves are in the power of their masters, a power recognized by the law of all nations. For all nations alike can see that masters have the power of life and death over their slaves. This meant that Roman slaves had no rights of their own. They could not legally marry, have families, own property, or even worship as they chose without their master's permission. They had no protection from physical or sexual violence inflicted by their owners. A slave's body, mind, labor, and even life belonged entirely to their master, a trauma and tragedy endured by millions of souls over centuries of Roman domination. So, as we continue to explore the harrowing existence of Roman slaves, keep in mind the sheer scope and diversity of this subjugated population. Theirs was not a monolithic experience, but rather a kaleidoscope of suffering, resilience, and sometimes even surprising agency within an institution of utmost cruelty. In our modern world, it is difficult and disturbing to fully comprehend this kind of systematized dehumanization, sanctioned by custom and law. But for much of Rome's long history, the oppression and exploitation of a huge enslaved underclass was not only accepted, it was fundamental to the glory and grandeur of Roman civilization itself. So with that sobering perspective in mind, let us now trace the footsteps of these Roman slaves as they toiled and endured across an empire built on their scarred backs. We'll begin in the bustling streets of Rome's great cities, where urban slaves labored in the households of the mighty and powerful. Stay tuned. Let us return now to the countryside, where a different sort of hardship awaited those slaves unfortunate enough to be sent to the fields and pastures. Here, On the great agricultural estates known as latifundia, armies of men and women toiled from sunrise to sunset under the watchful eye of overseers. The latifundia were massive plantations, some spanning thousands of acres, which produced the grain, fruit, wine, and livestock that fed burgeoning cities like Rome. They were factories of exploitation, squeezing wealth from the land on the backs of captive laborers. By the 1st century AD, these estates had swallowed up huge swaths of fertile land in Italy, relying on chains of enslaved workers rather than small farmers or tenants. Imagine the plight of an agricultural slave, rising before dawn in a barracks with dozens of others, eating a paltry meal of porridge or stale bread. Then it was out to the fields to begin the long day of ploughing, sowing, weeding, and harvesting, broken only by a brief midday rest, if that. The work was backbreaking, the days interminable. There were no weekends, no holidays, no relief save for a few religious festivals honoured by all but the cruelest masters. Slaves in the fields faced constant threats and abuse from the overseers and vilica, or estate managers, who demanded ceaseless productivity. These supervisors, often slaves themselves, were notoriously brutal, doling out beatings and lashings for the slightest disobedience or slowness, or sometimes simply for cruel pleasure. The Roman agronomist Columella coldly advised masters that farm slaves must be forced to work so that they are tamed by drudgery, and fits of obstinacy and rebelliousness must be prevented. Life on the latifundia ground men and women down to a stub, working them mercilessly as long as they were productive, then casting them aside when they were spent. The Roman elder Cato, famous for his ruthlessness, counselled selling off old and infirm slaves rather than wasting money on their upkeep. For these wretches, after a lifetime of labour, there was often no kinder fate than being abandoned to beg on the streets or die quietly in a ditch. As with slavery everywhere in the Roman world, living conditions for agricultural workers were generally squalid and degrading. Slaves were housed in cellars, barns, or cramped dormitories, men and women crowded together with little privacy or comfort. They were given only the coarsest food and clothing, as much as was needed to keep them productive, but nothing more. Archaeological evidence shows that slave skeletons often bear the marks of chronic malnutrition and repetitive stress injuries. But amid all this suffering, there was still a fiercely stubborn spark of humanity that refused to be extinguished. We can see it in the story of Spartacus, the Thracian gladiator turned slave who would shake the Roman world with a massive rebellion. Sometime around 73 BC, Spartacus and some 70 fellow gladiators seized weapons from their training school in Capua and seized their freedom, forming a ragtag army of escapees that swelled to 120,000 men at its height, defeating legion after legion sent to crush them. For 2 years, Spartacus's slave horde rampaged up and down the Italian peninsula, liberating tens of thousands of agricultural slaves to join their ranks, plundering estates and towns as they went. Plutarch tells us that Spartacus was a strategically brilliant commander who led his men to victory in no less than 9 battles against the legions. He claims that Spartacus wished to lead his army over the Alps, to disperse to their homelands in Gaul and Thrace, but was overruled by followers who wished to continue the pillaging. Regardless, Roman resolve hardened, and the rebels were finally cornered and crushed by the general Crassus in 71 BC. Some 6,000 survivors were crucified in a grisly spectacle along the Appian Way. But Spartacus's astonishing rise from slave to king of insurgents, albeit brief, was a reminder of the human spirit that still struggled against oppression, even in the darkest hour. For a happier tale, we might consider Tiro, the personal scribe of the great orator Cicero. Born a slave sometime around 100 BC, Tiro was clearly a brilliant man. He invented an early form of shorthand to help keep pace with Cicero's rapid dictation. a system which remained in use for centuries. Over decades of devoted service, he became Cicero's indispensable aide, researcher and editor, playing an unsung role in many of the speeches that made his master famous. Theirs appears to have been an unusually close bond for a master and slave. In his letters, Cicero expresses deep affection and concern for Tiro's well-being, chiding him as a workaholic who needed rest when he fell ill. And indeed, Cicero did grant Tiro his freedom, albeit late in life, a vanishingly rare act of manumission for the time. Once free, Tiro could have departed, but chose to continue assisting the aging Cicero, helping the orator assemble his life's work in the waning days of the Republic. Upon Cicero's death, Tiro took it upon himself to collect and publish his former master's letters, an invaluable trove for later historians, and even wrote a biography of Cicero, though sadly it has not survived. It was an extraordinary life trajectory, from servitude to scholarship, although one achieved more through fortune than justice. Tiro's story was the exception, not the rule. The vast majority of educated, skilled slaves never won the benevolence of manumission, no matter their merit or bond with their master. So while stories like Tiro's show that, in some cases, genuine ties of loyalty could bridge the vast power gulf between master and slave, we must not forget the harsh reality that the entire relationship rested on a foundation of institutional violence, exploitation, and domination. Behind the noblest words and sentiments, a master still held the power of life and death over their human chattel. This deeply embedded mentality of entitlement and domination over enslaved bodies, especially those of women, played out with disturbing frequency in the sexual relationships between masters and slaves. It was widely accepted that masters had sexual rights over their slaves, who had no legal standing to refuse or resist. The wives, daughters, and mistresses of citizen men were at least notionally protected by law from non-consensual sex. But slave women had no such rights or recourse. As property, their violation was not considered a legally actionable moral crime in the same sense. It was an offense against their master's property rights, but not the woman herself. So widespread was the sexual exploitation of slave girls and women that institutionalized rape, by modern definitions, was mundane throughout the slave-holding society of Rome. Strikingly, though, this culture of predation was so normalized in the Roman mindset that it was rarely acknowledged as even an ethical issue. When you buy a slave girl, you buy a compliant body to sate your desires, advised Horace matter-of-factly. The same poets and moralists who inveighed against marital infidelity said nothing about the widespread rape of slave women. Given the ubiquity and banality of these slave-master sexual relationships, it's likely that many Roman fathers knew or suspected that some of their slave-born children were their biological offspring. But they were not family. Slave mothers and children had no legal connection or rights of paternity. Some half-siblings may have played together innocently as children, master and slave, not knowing they shared a father. One particularly troubling result of slave women's vulnerability was the widespread use of slaves as wet nurses. It was common for upper-class women to send their infants to be breastfed by slave women for months or sometimes years after birth, to avoid the hassle and preserve their figures. But this forced surrogacy came at a cruel cost. The wet nurses had to be continuously pregnant to stimulate milk flow, meaning years of repeated forced mating. Often, the wet nurse's own newborn would be cast aside or sent to a slave auction, depriving both mother and child of essential bonding. One Roman doctor advised new mothers to carefully test a potential wet nurse's character and affection, as if a woman grieving the loss of her own baby could transfer warm maternal feelings to her nursling on demand. For these women, motherhood itself was a violation, their bodies and their children, the property of their masters. So in matters of sex and family, as in nearly all aspects of life, Roman slaves were vulnerable to the whims of their masters, treated more as objects of gratification than as feeling men and women. This is in jarring contrast to the ideals of liberty and rights proudly proclaimed by Roman statesmen and etched into their laws. But this hypocrisy was little dwelled on. The absolute subordination of slaves was simply an unquestioned fact of life for Roman elites. This casual objectification also meant that the bodily autonomy of slaves was routinely violated for sadistic entertainment. Roman banquets sometimes featured performances in which attractive slave girls or boys were ordered to have sex with each other for the titillation of the guests. More darkly, pretty young slaves of both sexes were often forced to serve as unwilling concubines, enduring rape and assault at the whim of their masters and mistresses. Roman literature is full of both ribald and winking references to this predation, and much more plaintive allusions to the trauma it inflicted, although often romanticized. The poet Martial captured the dynamic in a single taunting epigram. The slave boy says no, but the master says yes, so the slave boy's a liar. For a Roman slave, even the freedom to refuse unwanted touch and exposure was a luxury they did not possess. But not all slaves were helpless in the face of this exploitation. Wily slaves sometimes found ways to carve out a small degree of economic autonomy for themselves. Skilled and privileged slaves could earn tips, bonuses, and commissions in the course of their work. An enterprising cook might be allowed to pocket some profits from street-side sales, or a financial secretary could invest some of his master's capital and split the returns. These earnings, although still technically the property of the master, often accumulated into a fund called the peculium. Over years, a diligent slave could amass a substantial peculium nest egg in coins, jewelry, fine clothing, and other portable valuables. This gave them a small taste of economic agency denied to most of their fellow slaves. They could save up to buy their own freedom, ransom loved ones, or simply hoard a reserve of creature comforts. Of course, it all still belonged to the master, who could confiscate the peculium at any time on a whim. But many masters allowed favored slaves this indulgence, a small incentive for loyalty. One such example was Mutius, a slave of the wealthy Caecilius Jucundus in Pompeii. Through his work as the master's business agent, making loans and collecting debts, Mutius accrued a substantial peculium over the years. Surviving wax tablets show that he bought his own freedom for a hefty 1,300 sesterces and went on to become a prosperous freedman moneylender in his own right. It was a form of quasi-freedom, although still circumscribed and contingent on his former master's goodwill. So while the peculium gave some slaves a narrow path to a degree of economic autonomy and perhaps eventual freedom, it was still a flawed and fickle institution, entirely dependent on a master's indulgence. Behind the promise of self-bought manumission, it incentivized slaves to be industrious and compliant. The dream of freedom through peculium, elusive as it was for most, helped to pacify resentment and forestall resistance among those slaves who had the wit and opportunity to pursue it. But what of the faceless multitudes who toiled thanklessly for the state and public good, without even the meager hope of a peculium and freedom? Let us turn now to the lives of the public slaves, who were owned directly by the government and people of Rome. The life of a Roman slave was one of unrelenting hardship and toil, their humanity stripped away by a cruel institution that treated them as mere property. From before sunrise until late into the night, the slave's existence revolved around servicing their master's every whim and need. In the countryside, armies of agricultural slaves tended the vast latifundia estates that spread across Italy and the provinces. These plantation slaves faced the most brutal conditions of all. Under the watchful eyes of an overseer and his whip, they worked the fields from dawn till dusk, with scarcely a moment of rest, tilling soil, planting crops, harvesting grain, pressing olives. The unyielding cycle of backbreaking labor never ceased. One could hardly imagine a more punishing existence than that of a Roman agricultural slave. Their quarters were often squalid and cramped, their food meager, their treatment harsh. It was a life of unending, bone-wearying drudgery under the Mediterranean sun, all to enrich their absentee masters in faraway Rome. But some plantation slaves endured even worse ordeals in the mines and quarries that pockmarked the empire. Here, slaves were essentially worked to death, forced to carry loads of ore and stone in dark, suffocating tunnels. Illness, malnutrition, and injury were rampant. Slaves who faltered could expect the lash or worse. These wretches were the living dead, obliterated by the ground they mined. Yet one slave refused to submit to this crushing subjugation. His name was Spartacus, a Thracian gladiator sold into slavery. In 73 BC, Spartacus led a daring revolt, escaping his ludus gladiatorial school with a band of 70 fighters. As they rampaged across the Italian countryside, thousands of slaves rallied to join Spartacus, swelling his army to 120,000 men. For 2 years, Spartacus's slave horde defeated the legions sent to crush them, even ransacking towns on the outskirts of Rome itself. The Republic reeled at this unprecedented servile insurrection, the greatest threat to Roman power and prestige in generations. It was a terrifying reminder of the volcano of anger and resentment that seethed beneath the surface of Roman life. But in the end, not even Spartacus could break the chains of Roman slavery. His ragtag force was finally cornered and destroyed by the legions of Crassus in 71 BC. Some 6,000 survivors were crucified along the Appian Way, their bodies left to rot as a grisly deterrent to any other slave who dared to dream of freedom. Tragically, Spartacus's heroic rebellion was the exception, not the rule. Few Roman slaves had the means or opportunity to resist their bondage. Escape was almost impossible, given that slaves were branded or collared to mark their enslavement. A runaway faced crucifixion or worse if caught. And if the unthinkable happened and a slave attacked their master, the penalty was unimaginably brutal. Death by torture for them and every other slave in the household. So most Roman slaves trudged on beneath the yoke, stealing what moments of humanity they could amid the grind of servitude. One small mercy some enjoyed was the peculium. Pocket money they could earn to buy small luxuries, or, if they saved for decades, perhaps even purchase their freedom. Of course, this was entirely at the master's discretion. It was not a right, simply one of the myriad ways masters used material rewards alongside physical punishments to control their human property. However, a lucky few slaves did manage to rise above their station to lives of privilege and influence. The imperial household was staffed by thousands of slaves, some of whom leveraged their proximity to power into authority of their own. Perhaps the most stunning example was Cleander, a Phrygian slave who entered imperial service during the reign of Commodus. Through ruthless ambition, Cleander gained the trust of the unstable emperor, who appointed him Praetorian Chamberlain, the administrator of the imperial household. In this role, Cleander became the most powerful man in Rome after the emperor himself, using his total control over access to Commodus to sell government posts to the highest bidder. He accumulated a fortune in bribes and extorted the aristocracy at will, protected by the favor of the mercurial Commodus. For a former slave to wield such immense unchecked power was galling to the old patrician elite. But Cleander was untouchable, until a grain shortage in 190 AD caused the Roman mob to riot, demanding his head. Knowing his regime depended on the whims of the masses, Commodus reluctantly sacrificed Cleander to the mob, who tore the former slave chamberlain to pieces. A grim reminder that even the most powerful freedman was never truly free of his servile origins. Cleander's story was a rare exception in a world where manumission was vanishingly uncommon. Perhaps the best a Roman slave could hope for was to serve in the household of a learned master, one who appreciated intelligent slaves to assist in intellectual pursuits. Such was the life of Marcus Tullius Tiro, the personal secretary of the great orator Cicero. Tiro was an exceptionally gifted slave, so much so that Cicero entrusted him with transcribing and editing his speeches and correspondence. He was said to be the inventor of Latin shorthand, a system so innovative it remained in use for centuries. Tiro served Cicero faithfully for decades, acting as combination secretary, researcher, and confidant to the eminent statesman. Yet despite his remarkable abilities and closeness with Cicero, Tiro remained a slave for most of his life, a living testament to slavery's grip on even the most enlightened Roman minds. It was not until 53 BC, when Tiro was already in his 50s, that Cicero finally freed him. And even then, this manumission was as much a business transaction as an act of altruism. By freeing Tiro, Cicero was able to use him as literary executor to publish his unfinished works. Tiro's long road to freedom reveals the immense psychological trauma inflicted by Roman slavery. To be a slave was to have no sense of self-determination, no right to family or personal integrity. It meant internalizing your own inhumanity and subordinating your will to the caprices of another. The profound psychic scars slavery inflicted could last a lifetime, even for the fortunate few who gained their freedom. And those invisible wounds compounded the very visible brutality that Roman slaves faced every day. Slaves were beaten and flogged for the most minor infractions, burned with hot irons, even maimed and mutilated. The most sadistic masters invented perverse tortures for slaves who displeased them, like the aristocrat Vedius Pollio, who infamously fed disobedient slaves to the lampreys he kept in his villa's garden pond. Under Roman law, a slave's testimony was only admissible in court if extracted under torture, rendering them vulnerable to horrific questioning tactics. Some were sent to the dreaded ergastulum, private dungeons on wealthy estates where rebellious slaves were shackled and punished with impunity, hidden from the eyes of Rome's authorities. The ever-present threat of violence, physical violation, and death at the hands of one's master was the ultimate expression of the slave's non-humanity under Roman law and custom. A slave was, as Aristotle coldly put it, a living possession, a tool with a soul. This soulless calculus lay at the heart of Roman slavery. It was a monstrous institution that devoured the minds, bodies, and dignity of millions, fueling the glory of Rome with their blood and sweat and tears. An economic and psychological juggernaut upon which much of the empire was built. For at its height, Roman Italy was home to a staggering number of slaves, as much as a third of the population, up to 40% in the city of Rome itself. This huge slave population powered the mansions, farms, factories, mines, and galleys of a civilization. Millions of human tools with no more rights than the plows or looms they operated. Millions whose stories will never be told, whose names will never be known, swallowed up by the centuries and the sheer scale of the suffering they endured. But as we ponder the glittering monuments and marbled halls of Rome's glory, it is vital that we remember the forgotten souls who paid the price for that magnificence with their freedom and their lives. The story of Rome is also their story. The story of the humble girl snatched from her homeland to serve as maid, of the conquered soldier turned farmhand, of the child born into bondage who never saw the sun as a free man. They too helped shape the destiny of the world's greatest empire, even if their names are lost to time. So when we think of Rome, let us also think of them, the faceless slaves whose toil propped up the Republic and the Empire. Let us acknowledge the terrible foundation of oppression and unfreedom upon which so many of Rome's triumphs were built. Only then can we truly understand the city that once ruled the world. Only then can we see the cost of greatness etched in the furrowed brow of a slave. The stories of Rome's slaves may be lost to history, but if you look closely enough, you can still hear their whispers echoing through the centuries. In many ways, they are with us even today, in the roads we walk, the aqueducts we admire, the literature we read. One such whisper comes from a most unlikely source, the tomb inscription of a Roman woman named Alia Potestas. In a society where slaves were faceless and forgotten, Alia did something almost unheard of. She built an ornate tomb for her beloved slave Jucundus and inscribed it with her undying affection. "You were my alumnus, my friend, my companion," the epitaph reads. "No human being could be loved more than I loved you." It's a rare glimpse of humanity in a world that so often denied slaves their basic dignity. And it speaks to the complex realities of master-slave relationships in Rome. While the vast majority were built on exploitation and abuse, there were these uncommon exceptions, bonds of genuine devotion that transcended the brutality of the institution. We see this also in the story of Antonia Canis, a former slave of Antonia Minor, daughter of Mark Antony. Canis earned her freedom and even became an influential member of the imperial court and the mistress of the future emperor Vespasian. It was a remarkable rise for a woman who had once been chattel property. But these stories, touching as they are, were the extreme exceptions. For the vast majority of Rome's slaves, life promised only degradation and drudgery from cradle to grave. And the echoes of their suffering would reverberate through the ages, long after the fall of Rome. When we think of the great construction projects of the Romans, the Colosseum, the Pantheon, the Circus Maximus, we often marvel at the ingenuity and ambition, but we rarely stop to consider the human cost. The humble slaves who hauled the stones, mixed the mortar, and died in droves from accidents, exhaustion, and mistreatment. The same is true of the Roman literary canon, the speeches of Cicero, the histories of Livy and Tacitus, the poetry of Virgil and Ovid. We laud the brilliance of these elite Roman minds, but forget they were all slaveholders, dictating their works to slave secretaries and copyists late into the night by the light of sputtering oil lamps. Even the food and wine we so associate with the Romans, the garum and the honeyed dates, the Falernian vintages, all of it was planted, harvested, prepared, and served by armies of agricultural slaves, toiling under the sun and the lash. The excess and luxury of the Roman table had a bitter aftertaste, the sweat and blood of the unfree. But perhaps the most haunting legacy of Roman slavery is how it persisted and morphed through the centuries that followed. As the empire crumbled and fell, slavery endured in the medieval feudalism that succeeded Rome, in the transatlantic slave trade of the early modern period, in the cotton fields and kitchens of the antebellum South. The names and faces may have changed, but the fundamental concept of humans as property, as tools for exploitation, remained ingrained. It was a poison that lingered long in the body politic of the West, a symptom of the illness that was Rome's slave society. And so, as we close this chapter on the lives of Roman slaves, we do so with a heavy heart, for the untold millions who suffered in silence and anonymity, whose stories are forever lost to us. But we remember them still, in the monuments they built, the roads they paved, the harvests they reaped. They may have been erased from the record, expunged from the histories, but they were the bedrock on which one of the world's greatest civilizations was built. The unsung and unfree, the beaten and the broken. The slaves of Rome, whose blood and sweat greased the wheels of empire. We cannot give them back their names, their voices, their stolen lives, but we can honor their memory by remembering the human cost behind the glory that was Rome, by seeing the shadows in the light, the scars beneath the marble, the tears behind the triumphs. For slavery, as much as conquest and empire, was the true face of Rome, a civilization built on the bent backs of the unfree, and there is no statute of limitations on human suffering, no moratorium on empathy for those long dead. So let us spare a thought for those forgotten slaves across the long centuries, the ones who lived, struggled and died at the whim of their masters, the ones who dared to imagine freedom in a world of bondage, the ones who built the eternal city, brick by brick and block by block, with hands that were never their own. Theirs is a ghost story, a tale whispered in the silences of history. But if we listen closely enough, we can still hear them, in the stones of the Forum, the echoes of the Appian Way, the dust of the Colosseum. They are with us even now, the slaves of Rome, invisible but ever present, unsung but unforgotten. A reminder of the darkness that lurks behind the light, the inhumanity at the heart of even the greatest of human achievements. And in honoring their memory, we honor the best in ourselves, our capacity for compassion, our hunger for justice, our unending hope for a world where no one is in chains. For as long as we remember them, the slaves of Rome can never truly die. Life as a slave in the Roman Empire was a brutal, thankless existence of unending labor and cruelty, all to prop up the lavish lifestyles of the wealthy elite. For these downtrodden souls who made up such a significant portion of the population, each day was a waking nightmare in service to their masters. The vast majority of slaves in ancient Rome were not born into bondage, but fell into this wretched state through the misfortunes of war, piracy, or economic ruin. Defeated enemies were regularly carted back to Rome and sold as spoils of conquest. The military campaigns that expanded Roman power also fueled the ballooning ranks of human chattel that came to dominate society. For an unlucky captive, the harrowing journey into slavery often began with a traumatic uprooting from their homeland, as they were suddenly torn from kin and community. Herded like livestock and loaded onto ships, many did not survive the harsh conditions of this forced voyage to an unknown land. Those who endured would soon discover the fresh hell that awaited them. Upon arrival in Rome, new slaves were put on display in the markets, naked and humiliated, as prospective buyers poked and prodded to assess their fitness. Like any other tradable good, their value was coldly determined by age, health, appearance, and skill. The most expensive and prized slaves were the young and comely, destined for exploitation of the most degrading varieties. But by far the most common fate for freshly imported foreign slaves was a life of crushing agricultural labor on the flourishing latifundia estates that were devouring small farms and transforming Italy's landscape. Here, armies of shackled laborers toiled ceaselessly under the blistering sun and the lash of ruthless overseers. The sprawling plantations could not run without a steady influx of new slaves to replace the broken bodies that had been rapidly worked to death in the fields. The fortunate ones might be eventually permitted the minor dignity of living in crude huts with slave families rather than shackled in communal bunkhouses at night. But any perceived infraction or hint of disobedience invited brutal whippings and abuse from the ever-present overlords. Not all agricultural slaves faced such unrelenting misery, however. Tiro, the longtime slave of the renowned statesman Cicero, was permitted to work indoors as a secretary and scribe at his master's rural estate. Tiro's remarkable intellect and inventiveness even led him to develop an early system of Latin shorthand to aid in his clerical duties, an innovation that would long outlive his bondage. Indeed, it was the rare educated slaves like Tiro who might taste some reprieve from the grind of manual labor and enjoy largely indoor roles as tutors, clerks, or craftsmen. But these relatively privileged positions were few, and even elite slaves like doctors and accountants could be cast down into drudgery at the master's whim. Yet for all their hardship, the life of a rural slave was in some ways preferable to the claustrophobic, isolated existence of the urban house slave. Confined to the master's walls and forever on call, domestic slaves were on duty for nearly every waking hour, with only snatches of rest. Before dawn, they rose to prepare the household for the day, cleaning, cooking, serving, and attending to the family's every need well into the night. The educated slave Epictetus described the tragedy of the house servant's plight, always at the beck and call of tyrannical masters, and never in control of their own time or person. Is it nothing to be beaten, to be reviled, to be shut out of doors, to be treated worse than the dog? He lamented. But some household slaves did form close bonds with the master's family, particularly those involved in child rearing. The pedagogue was a slave tutor entrusted with overseeing the moral and intellectual education of the master's children, a role of significant responsibility and delicacy. Likewise, the nutritor or nanny was a slave woman charged with nursing and nurturing her owner's offspring, often at the cost of being separated from her own children. These intimate slaves walked a perilous line, always at risk of displeasing their mercurial masters through some inadvertent misstep or perceived failing with the children. Yet some were also known to be greatly esteemed within the household, even earning freedom at the end of a long and faithful service. Loyal house slaves could be granted a peculium, a small fund they were permitted to accumulate through tips, bonuses, or side work. Many saved for years, dreaming of someday purchasing their freedom. But manumission was exceedingly rare, and a slave's possessions always ultimately belonged to the master. The sliver of autonomy represented by the peculium could be snatched away at any time. Much rarer still was the act of freeing a slave out of genuine affection or regard. Cicero did eventually manumit his beloved secretary Tiro after decades of close collaboration and companionship. The elderly scholar was even said to have wept and embraced Tiro upon finally granting him freedom. So deep was their mutual fondness. But such sentimental acts were the exception rather than the rule in a society that viewed slaves as living tools without human dignity. Far more common was the callous sexual exploitation of vulnerable house slaves by their lecherous masters. Slave boys, and young women in particular, faced the constant threat of sexual assault and abuse. Comely girls purchased solely as concubines were euphemistically known as mistresses, but in truth, they were sex slaves subject to the cruel appetites of their owners. So ubiquitous was the sexual abuse of house slaves that one Roman wife famously quipped that the only way to ensure fidelity in this city is to people your house entirely with ugly slaves. But even the lowliest drudge might catch a twisted master's eye. The sense of total domination over another's body was a dark need some slave owners were all too eager to indulge. This depraved entitlement was exacerbated by the extreme youth of many domestic slaves. It was not uncommon for children as young as 7 to be auctioned off and thrust into a life of servitude. The pliant young were seen as more tractable and less prone to defiance. So no age was too tender to be ground under heel by an all-powerful master. One of the most disturbing tales of a Roman's cruelty towards his adolescent slaves comes down to us from the famed biographer Suetonius. He recounts how the notorious emperor Tiberius trained a bevy of little fishes. Slave boys he kept at his island estate, whom he forced to chase him while he went swimming and tease him with their licks and nibbles. The perverse sexual abuse these nameless youths endured is unimaginable. Beyond the sexual degradation, house slaves were always under threat of being viciously beaten for any perceived fault or sluggishness in their never-ending labor. The slightest mistake or moment of dullness could bring a swift flogging from master or mistress. And these brutal punishments were often capriciously meted out with little cause or justification, beyond a dark impulse to dominate. According to the philosopher Seneca, a slave will be beaten for coughing or sneezing so as to disturb his master's slumber. Those who displease their owners in more serious ways could face shockingly elaborate tortures and mutilations, from live burnings to forced gladiatorial combat. The master's capacity for depravity and violence was limitless. The perverse glee some masters took in tormenting their most helpless slaves was epitomized by the story of Vedius Pollio and his pet lampreys. This sadistic slave owner was said to keep a pool of monstrous flesh-eating eels into which he would gleefully cast disobedient slaves to be slowly devoured alive. The offender's agonized screams and the lamprey's thrashing made for twisted dinnertime entertainment. Such grotesque abuses may seem incomprehensible, but they were rooted in the prevailing Roman belief that slaves were fundamentally inferior and thus undeserving of moral consideration. Even great thinkers like Aristotle argued that some men were congenitally destined for slavery, that it was their natural state. Under Roman law, slaves were considered property, not people. They were but tools to be used as the master saw fit, whether as field laborers, craftsmen, miners, prostitutes, or even gladiators whose death throes served as lurid spectacle. A slave's life was one of total debasement and disposability, without rights or recourse. In the eyes of the law, a slave's testimony was only admissible in court if it had been obtained under torture, further incentivizing their horrific treatment. Interrogators could legally apply red-hot plates, the rack, or even crucifixion to extract the needed evidence or confessions through unimaginable suffering. The ultimate threat that loomed over every slave was a hideous death in the arena or on the cross. Slaves were routinely crucified for crimes as minor as petty theft, their flayed bodies displayed along the roadways as a grisly warning against disobedience and rebellion. So common was this horrific practice that the ancient geographer Strabo noted the roads leading into Rome are lined with tombs and crucified slaves. Indeed, the famous Appian Way became a miles-long corridor of ghastly crucifixions in the wake of Rome's most chilling slave revolt. In 71 BC, the gladiator Spartacus led an uprising that mushroomed into an army of 120,000 rebel slaves who terrorized Italy, defeating legion after legion before finally being crushed. As retribution for this unforgivable rebellion, a staggering 6,000 recaptured slaves were crucified along the Appian Way from Rome to Capua, their suffering and humiliation put on display for all to witness. The rotting bodies were left in place for months as an unforgettable deterrent against future insurgency. The story of Spartacus and his doomed uprising underscores both the desperation of the Roman slaves and the empire's ruthless commitment to keeping them ground underfoot. That even highly trained gladiators would rather risk annihilation than endure the misery and degradation of enslavement speaks to the soul-crushing horror of their bondage. But Spartacus's legendary exploits, fictionalized and celebrated though they may be today, should not obscure the grim reality that most slave rebellions were small, isolated, and swiftly crushed. The vast majority of Roman slaves lived and died without ever daring to resist their fate. They were simply too downtrodden and demoralized to contemplate revolt. Yet even in their lowest state, Roman slaves found small ways to cope and maintain a sliver of selfhood. Verni, or homeborn slaves, sometimes enjoyed a deeper connection to the master's household and could even be playmates to the children. Some built shadow families and communities within the slave ranks below the notice of their owners. Others took solace in exotic foreign religions and mystery cults that offered the promise of rebirth and eternal salvation. One unexpected outlet for a lucky few domestic slaves was a quasi-entrepreneurial role in managing the master's urban assets. These trusted high-level slaves could be granted authority to oversee the household's rental properties, collect debts, and conduct business in the master's name. Here they could briefly taste a modicum of autonomy and importance, so long as they never failed in their duties. A shining example was Felix, the slave property manager of Cicero's rival Clodius. Through his acumen and ambition, Felix was able to gain great wealth for his master's estate, taking a cut for himself along the way. His tenacity was rewarded with freedom, and he eventually rose to become the provincial governor of Judea, a remarkable ascent for one born in chains. But stories like Felix's were exceedingly rare. Most urban slaves would never know even a moment of self-determination or dignity. For the lowly drudges who kept the city running, each day was a trial of endless toil and abuse. The miners, porters, cleaners, and construction workers had no hope of advancement or reprieve. Consider the faceless slaves who ground their bodies down to build the empire's most glorious monuments. The Colosseum, that enduring symbol of Roman power and spectacle, was constructed largely through slave labor in under 10 years. Teams of up to 12,000 slaves worked non-stop to erect the 157-foot-tall amphitheater from giant blocks of travertine stone. Slaves did the backbreaking work of quarrying, hauling, and hoisting the 100,000 cubic meters of stone that would form the Colosseum's iconic facade. How many nameless slaves perished to create this magnificent arena, where yet more slaves would die for the entertainment of Roman crowds? The bodies of exhausted builders and doomed gladiators alike were unceremoniously discarded, mere human grist to feed the glory of Rome. The great monuments and feats of Roman engineering are all the more astounding when one considers that they were built without modern machines or technology. The soaring aqueducts, impregnable fortifications, and towering arches that still inspire awe today were constructed using only pulleys, levers, and an unimaginable amount of human suffering. At the empire's peak, teams of skilled slave engineers transformed Rome into the majestic imperial capital. New roads, bridges, and aqueducts expanded across Italy and beyond, all on the shoulders of slave muscle. Slave labor fueled construction on an epic scale, raising triumphal arches, basilicas, baths, and temples of breathtaking ingenuity. An army of over 4,000 slaves toiled for years to complete the sprawling baths of Caracalla alone, an opulent 50-acre complex clad in marble and gold. Sweating work gangs hefted massive blocks to erect the soaring 130-foot ceilings and install the complex systems of drainage and hypercaust heating that would warm the lavish pleasure palace. Day after day, from sunup to sundown, they labored, sometimes in chain gangs, always under threat of the lash. The splendor and luxury of the finished complex stood in stark contrast to the wretched and broken slaves who brought it into being at such great human cost. The emperor's official building planners and architects who masterminded these ambitious marvels were sometimes themselves educated Greek slaves. The innovative designs they produced stood for centuries as enduring symbols of Roman power and artistry. But the true craftsmanship belonged to the anonymous toiling slaves who made their dreams a reality. It is a bitter irony that the ingenuity and skill of these slave laborers helped strengthen and sustain the very empire that kept them oppressed. With every road laid, fort erected, and monument raised, they were unwittingly forging the chains of their own bondage ever tighter. But of course, construction was not the only form of slave labor that maintained Roman dominion. The empire's much-feared war machine was also dependent on slaves both on and off the battlefield. A special class of slaves known as colones traveled with the legions to handle pack animals, repair armor, and transport military baggage. They were even sometimes pressed into service as reserve fighters. More sinister were the larari, slave torturers who accompanied the army to brutalize captives and extract information using the vilest methods of coercion and cruelty. These pitiless men wielded their tools of pain with a savagery surpassed only by the carnifices, the state's official executioners, who were themselves condemned slaves. To be a carnifex was to become an instrument of empire, dealing out death and suffering to the most wretched enemies of Rome. These state-owned slaves carried out public crucifixions, live burnings, beheadings and torture so ghastly that even hardened Romans averted their eyes. The carnifices were loathed and shunned as unclean outcasts, reviled even by their fellow slaves. Public slaves tasked with civic maintenance and upkeep fared little better than the military auxiliaries and executioners. Slaves swept the streets, collected refuse, maintained the roads and aqueducts, and handled the grim drudgery that kept the city running, all for no pay and even less prestige than their domestic counterparts. But perhaps the worst off of all Roman slaves were those who toiled and perished in the mines of Spain and Greece to slake the empire's insatiable need for silver and other precious metals. Relegated to hell on earth, these pitiful wretches were worked to death in darkness and despair, extracting the riches that gilded Rome's glory. Slave miners spent their short, miserable lives underground, emerging only to eat and sleep chained together in communal squalor. Most would never again see the sun or breathe free air before succumbing to starvation, accidents, or disease in lightless tunnels and shafts. They died unmourned and unremembered in the bowels of the earth, so their masters could live in splendor. The lot of a slave in the notoriously deadly mines was so awful that even hard-bitten Romans expressed a degree of pity. Condemned criminals and vanquished foes could expect no worse fate than a life sentence of hard labor in the pits that swallowed men whole and spat out only riches and broken bodies. Amid so much misery and exploitation, it can be hard to believe that anything like genuine bonds of affection could exist between master and slave. But even in this cruel and rigid hierarchy of power, there emerged the occasional story of camaraderie and devotion that transcended status. One of the most famous examples was that of the Emperor Claudius and his slave Narcissus. A shrewd and able administrator, Narcissus rose to become Claudius's most trusted advisor and was even granted authority to act on the emperor's behalf. His power and influence were so great that rival senators were forced to defer. The public ignominy and humiliation a slave might face knew no bounds. One particularly degrading practice was the use of slaves in the arena for the bloodthirsty entertainment of the Roman masses. Slaves who had displeased their masters or were merely deemed unfit for other labor could find themselves cast into the Colosseum, weaponless and defenseless, to be torn apart by wild beasts as the crowd roared. Imagine the sheer terror of a slave who had only ever known a life of servitude, thrust suddenly before a baying mob, with lions and tigers released to devour them. They had committed no crime, save for being a slave. The sand beneath their feet would turn red as slaves were maimed and mauled, their screams intermingled with the crowd's cheers in a symphony of suffering that echoed through the arena. This was not merely a form of execution, but a spectacle, an abhorrent form of public entertainment. Slaves were fodder, their lives mere tinder to fuel the flames of the mob's excitement. The Colosseum held 50,000 spectators, 50,000 faces that would watch with glee as a slave was ripped limb from limb. The games were a grotesque display of the complete devaluation of a slave's humanity. Not all slave gladiators met such a brutal end, of course. Some, through skill at arms and the favor of the crowd, could earn glory and even freedom. The most famous of these was Spartacus, a gladiator from Thrace, who would go on to lead a spectacular slave rebellion. But for each Spartacus, thousands of nameless slaves died anonymously on the sands, for the baying pleasure of the masses. This practice provides a startling insight into the psychology of slavery in Rome. Slaves were not seen as people, but property. If a master grew bored of his human chattel, he could simply cast it into the arena like a child discarding a toy. The crowd too was inured to this suffering. A slave being devoured by animals was no different to watching a criminal executed. The lines between human and object, between person and property, were blurred beyond recognition. It is important to remember that for all their degradation, the slaves dying in the Colosseum were human beings, with the same fears and feelings as any one of us. They had been torn from their homes and families, forced into servitude, and now faced an ignoble and terrifying death. As we marvel at the grand ruins of the Colosseum today, it is vital that we acknowledge the human cost embedded in those ancient stones. The gladiatorial games were not the only form of public humiliation a slave might endure. In many wealthy Roman households, slaves were also forced into degrading forms of entertainment for the amusement of their masters and guests. This could include anything from singing and dancing to more humiliating acts like serving as human footstools or even enduring abuse and beatings. One particularly stomach-churning practice was the use of slaves as vomitoria at lavish banquets. The Romans, as is well known, were prone to overindulgence. At extravagant feasts, guests would gorge themselves on rich foods, then purposefully vomit so they could continue eating. Slaves would be positioned around the room with bowls to catch the vomit of the revelers. Imagine the utter degradation of being used as a human receptacle for the half-digested gluttony of your masters. These slaves, who might spend their days cooking and serving these magnificent feasts, were not even allowed the basic human dignity of looking away in disgust. They had to stand, heads bowed, holding a bowl of vomit, a testament to the complete lack of regard for their humanity. The message was clear. A slave was not a person, but an object, a tool to facilitate the excesses and indulgences of their Roman masters. Even in death, a slave could not escape the yoke of their servitude. Slave suicides were common in ancient Rome. Many preferred to take their own lives rather than endure the hardships and indignities of slavery. But for a slave, even the right to end one's own suffering was not guaranteed. Legally, a master could be financially compensated if their slave died before a certain age. As such, some masters would go to great lengths to prevent their slaves from taking their own lives, not out of any sense of compassion, but merely to protect their investment. A slave who attempted suicide might be chained and tortured as punishment, their despair compounded by the knowledge that even in death, their body was not their own. This bleak reality is encapsulated in the famous story of Vedius Pollio, a nobleman in the time of Augustus. Pollio was notorious for his cruelty to slaves. It was said he would feed slaves who displeased him to the lampreys in his fish pond. On one occasion, a slave accidentally broke a crystal cup. Fearing his master's wrath, he threw himself at Augustus's feet, begging to be executed in any other way than being eaten alive by the fish. Moved by the slave's desperation, Augustus demanded that Pollio free him and ordered all his crystal cups to be broken. Pollio, though outraged, dared not disobey the emperor. This tale, though it ended well for the individual slave, highlights the brutal reality. A slave's life was held in such low regard that a broken cup could warrant a death sentence. That Pollio's cruelty shocked even the Romans, a society so inured to the brutalities of slavery, speaks volumes. These stories paint a chilling picture of the psychological impact of slavery. To be a slave was to exist in a constant state of fear and anxiety. Any small mistake or perceived slight could result in brutal punishment or even death. The complete lack of control over one's own life and bodily autonomy was mentally and emotionally shattering. Imagine the impact of knowing that your life was considered less valuable than an inanimate object. that your hopes, dreams, and desires were utterly irrelevant to those who owned you, that you could be abused, violated, or even killed on a whim, and no one would bat an eye. The mental toll of this constant dehumanization is almost unfathomable to us today. Yet even under these unspeakable conditions, the human spirit endured. Slaves found small ways to resist their bondage, to maintain some shred of autonomy and dignity in a world that denied them both. They formed secret networks and communities, finding solace in shared suffering. They whispered stories and songs of freedom, keeping hope alive in even the darkest of circumstances. Some, like Spartacus, rose up in open rebellion, preferring to die fighting for freedom than live in chains. Others, like Aesop, the famous storyteller, used their wit and wisdom to challenge the very foundations of the system that enslaved them. These acts of defiance, whether large or small, are a testament to the unbreakable human spirit, the inextinguishable yearning for freedom and dignity that lives within us all. As we reflect on the brutality of slavery in ancient Rome, it is important that we remember these stories. The scars of slavery are not just etched into the grand monuments and ruins of Rome, but in the untold stories of resilience and resistance of the enslaved. Every magnificent villa and sprawling latifundia was built on the blood, sweat, and tears of slaves. Every glittering triumph and lavish banquet was made possible by their suffering. The story of Rome is not just one of emperors and generals, of conquests and glory. It is also the story of the nameless, faceless millions who toiled in servitude, whose humanity was denied, but whose labor built an empire. As we marvel at the grandeur that was Rome, let us also acknowledge the darkness that lurked beneath. For only in remembering the brutality of the past can we hope to build a more just and humane future. So ends our exploration of the brutal reality of life as a Roman slave. It is a story of unimaginable suffering, of cruelty and dehumanization on a mass scale. But it is also a story of resilience, of the unbreakable human spirit that endured in the face of unspeakable adversity. As we close this chapter, I invite you to take a moment to reflect on these forgotten lives. The next time you see a grand Roman monument or marvel at the ingenuity of Roman engineering, remember the human cost. Remember the slaves who died in the Colosseum for the entertainment of the masses. Remember those who took their own lives rather than endure another day in chains. Remember the resilience of those who found ways to resist, to maintain their humanity in a world that sought to strip it from them. Their stories are a reminder of the darkness that humans are capable of inflicting on one another, but also of the unbreakable strength of the human spirit. They are a call to vigilance, to ensure that such cruelty is never again tolerated or normalized. And they are an invitation to empathy, to recognizing the humanity in all people, regardless of their station or circumstance. So let us remember the slaves of ancient Rome, and in doing so, recommit ourselves to the ongoing struggle for justice, equality, and human dignity. For in the end, their story is not just the story of Rome, but the story of us all, a reminder of how far we've come and how far we still have to go. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the darkest chapters of Roman history. May we emerge from it with a renewed commitment to the light of compassion, empathy, and justice for all. The plight of public slaves is often overshadowed by the more visible sufferings of domestic servants and farm workers. But these faceless laborers, toiling anonymously for the state, endured some of the harshest conditions of all. Imagine the armies of public slaves who cleaned the streets, maintained the aqueducts, and constructed Rome's magnificent monuments. From the crack of dawn until dusk, they performed back-breaking labor, erecting towering stone buildings and paving roads in the blistering Mediterranean sun. They were the ones who built the gleaming temples, grand basilicas, and triumphal arches that bedazzled the public. yet their contributions went unrecognized and unappreciated. Even worse was the fate of slaves confined to the empire's mines and quarries, ripping lead, silver, gold, and marble from the earth in dark, suffocating tunnels. Worked mercilessly and given the barest sustenance to survive, these wretches rarely lasted more than a few hellish years in such extreme conditions. The riches and glory of Rome, built from the jewels and stone they mined, came at the cost of their miserable lives, snuffed out in lonely darkness deep underground. Some public slaves held roles that made them hated and feared by the populace and other slaves alike. The carnifices, state executioners, and torturers were universally loathed for their grim, blood-stained work. Although they wielded a degree of power and influence, these slaves were still shunned as the lowest of the low, their humanity tarnished by the brutalities they inflicted on others. Many a free Roman shuddered at the thought of falling into the hands of these emperors' butchers. But within the imperial household, a public slave could rise to astonishing power and influence. The emperors relied on a vast staff numbering in the thousands to manage their sprawling estates and attend to their every need. At the height of the empire, it's estimated that 20,000 slaves and freedmen served the imperial family. The most capable and clever of these slaves could amass substantial authority and wealth as the emperor's right-hand men. One such figure was Cleander, a Phrygian slave who became the chamberlain and most trusted advisor of Emperor Commodus in the late 2nd century AD. Through cunning and ambition, Cleander worked his way up from humble servitude to controlling access to the emperor, selling public offices and rich appointments for exorbitant bribes and ruling Rome as the power behind the throne. For a decade, Cleander dominated the imperial court, eliminating rivals and amassing a fortune to rival the emperors. He was said to own estates all over the empire, worked by 20,000 of his own slaves. His influence and arrogance grew so immense that when Rome was racked by famine, the people blamed Cleander's corruption and incompetence. In AD 190, with the capital on the brink of riot, Commodus had no choice but to order his once indispensable chamberlain beheaded to appease the mob. Cleander's dizzying rise from slave to de facto ruler and his sudden downfall illustrate both the potential for advancement and the precariousness of life in the emperor's service. Even the most powerful of imperial slaves enjoyed their status at the ruler's whim. All it took was a snap of the imperial fingers to send even the mightiest slave to the scaffold. But for the faceless thousands of public slaves who kept the city and empire running, there was no such opportunity or hope for advancement, only endless toil and anonymity. They were the ones who built Rome, but were never recognized. The gleaming stones of the Forum and Colosseum might as well have been mortared with their blood, sweat, and tears. Consider for a moment the human cost behind the glorious facade of imperial Rome. Everything the Romans took for granted, from the roads they walked on to the buildings they marveled at, was the product of slaves' agony and labor. The might, power, and splendor of Rome was literally built on their backs. Yet we rarely hear their stories or learn their names. At best, they appear as footnotes of history or as bit players in the lives of the great and powerful. The stories of slaves like Cleander are vanishingly rare. Most labored, suffered, and died in obscurity without leaving any mark or memory for posterity. We can only imagine their struggles and sacrifices that made the grandeur of Rome possible. So the next time you picture the Rome of gleaming marble, of awe-inspiring monuments and engineering marvels, pause for a moment to reflect on the faceless, unnamed slaves whose blood and toil raised it all from the earth. Their pain may be unrecorded and their stories untold, but their lives form the invisible foundations of history. Just as harrowing as the plight of public slaves was the treatment and punishment meted out to those who displeased their masters. In Roman law, slaves were considered mere property to be used and disposed of at their owner's whim. An old saying held that a man has as many enemies as he has slaves, a testament to the inherently adversarial relationship between master and human chattel. To keep their slaves docile and obedient, Roman masters had no compunctions against inflicting vicious cruelties and demeaning punishments. Flogging with whips was a universal disciplinary tool, with slaves beaten mercilessly for the slightest perceived offense or infraction. Some masters took pride in devising ever more sadistic and creative tortures to cow their human property into submission. One of the most depraved was Vedius Pollio, a wealthy friend of Emperor Augustus, who devised a singularly chilling method for executing troublesome slaves. Whenever one displeased him, Pollio would have the unfortunate wretch tossed into a pool of ravenous lampreys to be devoured alive. The lampreys were a kind of jawless fish resembling eels, known for their razor-sharp teeth. The gruesome sight of the thrashing, screaming slave being shredded and picked clean by the swarming, blood-frenzied creatures was said to thrill Pollio immensely. According to the biographer Seneca, Emperor Augustus himself once dined at Pollio's villa when a slave attending the feast accidentally broke a crystal drinking glass. The terrified servant fell to his knees begging for mercy, but Pollio coldly ordered him thrown to the lampreys. Shocked by this cruelty, Augustus intervened and spared the boy's life, then commanded all of Pollio's crystal glasses smashed to punish his arrogant sadism. But for all his power, even the emperor could not compel Pollio to free or spare his slaves. That was a master's sacred right. Just as common as beatings was the Roman practice of branding slaves with red-hot irons as a mark of ownership and a punishment. The poet Martial quipped that a man whose face is more branded than a tattered manuscript was undoubtedly a slave. The excruciating mutilation served the dual purpose of permanently disfiguring a slave for easy identification, while also inflicting such searing agony that it shattered the spirit. Many slaves had their foreheads seared with the letters FUG for fugitivus, runaway, a common offense that struck terror into every owner's heart. For slaves accused of more serious transgressions like theft, assault, or rebellion, crucifixion was the ultimate penalty. This unspeakably agonizing and protracted death involved nailing or binding the victim to a wooden cross and leaving them to suffer for days as a public spectacle. Crucifixion sent a chilling message to other slaves about the futility of resistance and the omnipotence of Roman power. So frequent was this ghastly practice that the great slave rebellions which shook Rome were inevitably followed by mass crucifixions. In 132 BC, at the end of the First Servile War in Sicily, 20,000 defeated slaves were crucified. A century later, after Spartacus's famous uprising was crushed in 71 BC, 6,000 rebellious slaves were crucified along the Appian Way. For miles on end, thousands of crosses bearing mutilated bodies stretched from Rome to Capua, a grisly, unending avenue of agony and death. Even more dreaded than these punishments was the ergastulum, a private underground dungeon found on many Roman estates, where disobedient slaves were imprisoned and worked in chains as a form of living death. Emaciated, scarred, half-mad from deprivation and abuse, the wretches consigned to the ergastulum represented the true underclass of this slave society. Reviled and abandoned by all, few lasted long in that fetid darkness before succumbing to despair or disease. To be a slave in Rome was to exist under the constant shadow of violence, to know that one's body and will could be broken on a whim. It's little wonder that many chose to end their own lives rather than endure such torment, or embarked on desperate bids for freedom that almost inevitably ended in even worse suffering. The rare tales of successful resistance and escape only underscored the near impossibility of breaking one's bonds. Through the busy streets of Rome, a discreet sedan chair wove its way towards one of the city's grandest villas. Inside, a wary slave named Felix clutched a set of wax tablets that could change his life forever. He was carrying a top-secret message from his master, the wealthy senator Aulus Valerius Flaccus. Just hours earlier, Felix had been roughly shaken awake before dawn by the master's son, Publius. "Get up, you lazy dog," the young patrician had barked. "My father has an urgent task for you." Felix was accustomed to such rude awakenings. As one of the hundreds of slaves in the senator's household, he existed in a state of constant readiness, his body and will entirely at the whims of his masters. Rising wearily from his pallet in the cramped, fetid slave quarters, Felix quickly threw on his rough woolen tunic and hurried to the master's chambers. Senator Flaccus was already up and writing at his desk by oil lamp. He barely glanced at Felix as he entered. Without a word, the Dominus thrust a sealed wax tablet at him. "Take this to Marcus Tullius Cicero and be quick about it," Flaccus snapped. "Tell no one of your errand. Now go!" Felix bowed his head. Yes, Domine. He was used to such peremptory commands. A slave learned early on that his role was to obey without hesitation or question. The young slave was just grateful he had not displeased the irascible master this morning and earned a beating. Slipping out of the villa, Felix began the long trek across the city to Cicero's mansion. The senator's message was clearly urgent to send him out at such an unseemly early hour. Felix's stomach growled with hunger, but he knew better than to stop for food. Slaves ate last in a Roman household, and only whatever meager portions were left over. As he hurried along, Felix pondered what business his master might have with the famous orator and statesman Cicero. Flaccus had acquired him a year ago to serve as a messenger and secretary, taking advantage of Felix's skill with letters, which was rare for a slave. Before that, Felix had been sold from one provincial household to another, his life an endless succession of drudgery and servitude. But even an educated slave like Felix had little notion of the machinations of his elders and betters. He knew his role was simply to deliver his master's message with alacrity and discretion. In truth, he was relieved to be out of the house on such an errand, for it meant a brief respite from the constant demands and abuses of the senator's family. Suddenly, Felix froze in his tracks at an unexpected sight ahead. There, on the cross street, a grisly row of crosses had been erected, from which hung the broken bodies of men. The fetid stench of death wafted over on the early morning breeze. Felix approached hesitantly, compelled by a mixture of revulsion and morbid curiosity. As he drew closer, the slave realized with a wave of nausea that he recognized one of the crucified men. It was Drusus, a fellow bondsman from a nearby household. The two slaves had formed something of a friendship in snatched conversations at the market and baths. Now Drusus's body hung lifeless, his joints grotesquely distorted, and gruesome wounds marking where the nails had been driven through his flesh. A small wooden titulus hung around the corpse's neck, pronouncing his crime: "Serves fugitives," a runaway slave. Felix shuddered and turned away from the hideous sight, suddenly anxious to put as much distance as possible between himself and his crucified friend. He now understood all too clearly the ruthless measures Roman masters would take to punish disobedient slaves and deter others from flight. With a new sense of urgency, Felix resumed his journey, all too aware of his own precarious and powerless place in Roman society. As a mere slave, his body and soul were the property of another, to be used and disposed of as they saw fit. He could only pray that his servitude did not one day lead him to a similarly wretched fate. After over an hour's walk, Felix's aching feet finally brought him to the stately facade of Cicero's mansion. It was the grandest private residence he had ever seen, adorned with frescoes, columns, and marble statues. Even the slaves here were better dressed than any citizen in his master's provincial hometown. Taking a deep breath, Felix approached the door and lifted the bronze knocker. Suddenly he hesitated, the dire warning of secrecy from his master resounding in his head. Flaccus had instructed him to give the message directly and solely to Cicero himself. But how could a mere slave demand an audience with Rome's most illustrious orator? Felix's knock was answered by an imperious-looking slave steward. The man eyed Felix's threadbare tunic and dusty feet with an expression of aristocratic disdain. "Deliveries and petitioners are to use the rear entrance," the steward sniffed haughtily. Felix swallowed hard. "Forgive me, sir, but I bear an urgent message from my master, Aulus Valerius Flaccus, for Cicero's hand only." "His name is Marcus Tullius Cicero," the steward corrected him frostily. "And he is far too busy to be bothered by the likes of you. Now go around back where you belong." But as the servant moved to slam the door in his face, Felix wedged his foot across the threshold, ignoring the shooting pain as the heavy wood crushed his toes. Holding out the tablet, with its distinctive senatorial seal, he locked eyes with the other slave. "Please," Felix entreated, "this is a matter of the utmost importance and discretion. I beg you, take me to Cicero at once." His tone was desperate, but also infused with a quiet power that in another life might have made Felix himself a formidable patrician. The steward's eyes widened at the sight of the seal, and his officious demeanor noticeably paled. Clearly, he knew that displeasing an esteemed senator could lead to severe retribution for a slave. "Very well," he capitulated tersely, opening the door to allow Felix to step inside. "But cause any trouble, and I'll personally see you whipped." Felix followed the steward through the lavish atrium and marbled halls, awed by the opulence surrounding him despite his clandestine mission. The grandeur of this house surpassed anything he had ever witnessed. The sheer wealth required to finance such magnificence was staggering, but the young slave reminded himself that for all the trappings of luxury, this was still very much the domain of an elite Roman male, supported by the labor of slaves like himself. He noticed how the household slaves moved about their morning tasks with quick efficiency, desperate to avoid a punishing word or blow from their masters. For a brief, surreal moment, Felix allowed himself to fantasize that he was not a slave, but a guest in this illustrious home. How different his life would be if he had been born to a patrician family, his days devoted to pleasure and politics rather than servitude and drudgery. But such dreams were as futile as they were treacherous. A slave had about as much chance of becoming a senator as he did of sprouting wings and flying. The rigid hierarchy of Roman society was as immutable as the rising and setting of the sun. The steward led Felix to a closed door and knocked sharply, then pushed it open without awaiting a reply. "Domine, this slave claims to have an urgent message for you from Aulus Valerius Flaccus." The room was a small but lavishly appointed study, its walls lined with shelves of scrolls and the air perfumed with exotic incense. At the center sat Cicero himself, bent over a writing desk. Dressed in a snow-white toga with a regal purple stripe, he emanated an aura of power and austerity that made Felix almost shake with intimidation. Cicero glanced up, his expression severe. "Yes. What is it?" The great orator sounded more irritated than intrigued by the intrusion. His mouth suddenly as dry as the Egyptian desert, Felix stepped forward and held out the tablet with a trembling hand. "My master sends you this, Domine," he croaked. Cicero snatched the tablet and unrolled it, waving a dismissive hand at the waiting slaves. "Leave us," he ordered brusquely. Felix and the steward bowed and hastily retreated from the chamber. As the door closed behind them, Felix saw Cicero bend his stately head and begin to intently read the message. Then they were alone again in the long marbled hallway. Back to the kitchens with you then, the steward snapped, resuming his officious air. And be quick about it. I won't have an untrained house slave loitering about the domus. Please, sir, Felix protested. I cannot return until my master's message is answered. He knew all too well the likely punishment for failing to complete his assigned task. The steward shot him an impatient glare. You'll wait out in the street then, and be grateful I don't throw you out on your ear. He pointed imperiously towards the vestibule. Head bowed in defeat, Felix turned and shuffled back the way he had come. But as he reached the gleaming door, it suddenly swung open, revealing an ashen-faced Cicero. The senator beckoned him back with a grave expression. It seems you have been enjoined in a most serious affair, Cicero announced. You must swear to me, on your life, that you will repeat nothing of what you have seen or heard here today. Wide-eyed, Felix nodded his solemn assurance. I swear it, Domine. I am my master's humble instrument, nothing more. Let us pray to the gods that is enough, Cicero muttered darkly. Placing a hand on Felix's shoulder, he guided the young slave into another room furnished with rich couches and low tables. A sumptuous array of fruit, cheeses, and pastries was laid out on silver platters. Recline and eat, the senator ordered, assuming his own position on a crimson divan. I suspect we may have much to discuss. Felix hesitated, scarcely believing what he was hearing. Never in his life had he been invited to dine with such an illustrious citizen. The very notion of a slave sharing a table with a senator was unthinkable. Yet Cicero's tone brooked no argument. Gingerly, expecting at any moment to be rebuked for his impertinence, Felix settled himself on the edge of a gilt-legged couch. His stomach rumbled audibly as he eyed the exotic delicacies before him. Figs, dates, almonds, honeyed cakes. Luxuries he could never have dreamed of enjoying. Cicero regarded him intently over the rim of his wine cup. Tell me, the great man pressed, what do you know of the situation between your master and Gaius Antonius Hybrida? Felix blinked in confusion. In truth, he had little notion of his master's political dealings, nor any awareness of the enmity between Flaccus and Antonius. As a slave, he was privy only to snatches of conversation and furtively glimpsed documents, left to piece together his own incomplete understanding. But before Felix could stammer out a reply, the door to the chamber flew open with a resounding bang. Both slave and senator leapt to their feet in alarm as a full century of soldiers came pouring into the room, led by a grim-faced officer in a crested helmet. The men quickly surrounded Felix and Cicero, swords drawn and levelled at their throats. Marcus Tullius Cicero, the officer announced in a stentorian bellow. By order of the Senate and people of Rome, I hereby place you under arrest for conspiracy and treason against the Republic. Cicero uttered a choking sound of outrage, his eyes flashing with indignation. On what grounds do you dare accuse me? He sputtered. I am a senator and ex-consul of Rome. But the commander was unmoved by his protests. Evidence has been presented of your secret collusion with Catiline and his rebellious followers. You will come with us to face the judgment of your peers. At a curt gesture from their leader, 2 soldiers seized Cicero by the arms and started to drag him bodily from the room. For a moment, Felix remained frozen, paralyzed by shock and terror. But as he watched the venerable statesman being hauled away like a common criminal, his feet suddenly propelled him after them, heedless of the armed soldiers on every side. Wait, he cried out desperately. This is all a terrible mistake. My master's message will surely prove Cicero's innocence. The commander whirled around, his eyes narrowing with suspicion at the young slave who dared to interfere in official business. You have this message, boy, he demanded incredulously. Felix patted his tunic and belt frantically, only to realize with a sickening lurch that the wax tablet was no longer in his possession. He must have left it behind in Cicero's study in his confusion. I did, Domine, he croaked miserably, his voice barely above a whisper. But it seems to have been mislaid. A likely story, the officer sneered. He nodded curtly to one of his men. Seize that slave as well. If he is in league with the traitors, he will face the same justice. Felix had no time to protest before rough hands grabbed him and iron shackles were clamped around his wrists. He could only watch in numb horror as he was dragged in chains from the once gleaming mansion that now seemed as dark and ominous as a tomb. As he stumbled into the street behind Cicero and their grim-faced captors, Felix trembled with the terrible realization of what likely awaited them both: agonizing torture and humiliating public execution, the standard punishments for traitors to Rome. An ironic fate indeed for two men who had only sought to serve their masters and their republic. In that moment, Felix saw with brutal clarity the cheapness of a slave's life in the eyes of Roman law and society. It mattered not that he was an innocent pawn, unknowingly entangled in a deadly political web. His word would count for nothing, his testimony less than worthless. As a slave, he was but an expendable commodity, his death as insignificant as the swatting of a bothersome fly. Tears of anger and dread welled in Felix's eyes as the soldiers marched them through the awakening city streets, back towards the Forum and their inevitable judgment. He could only pray to the gods, who had so cruelly abandoned him for a swift and merciful end, and that oblivion would wipe away the stain and suffering of his ill-starred existence. The grim promise of Elysium seemed a cold comfort for the brutal realities of a Roman slave's life and death. As they emerged onto the crowded square, a raucous mob was already assembling, drawn by the rumors of a senatorial trial and the prospect of bloody spectacle. Felix shrank back in horror, trembling at the thought of Drusus's wretched fate and the certain knowledge that his own broken body would soon be on public display. A pitiable warning to other slaves who dared to dream of a better life. But as he was thrust, stumbling onto the tribunal steps, Felix suddenly glimpsed a startling sight that kindled the slightest spark of desperate hope in his chest. There, standing tall and resplendent in the golden sunlight, was his master Senator Flaccus, quietly conferring with the praetor and a knot of other stone-faced patricians. Felix's heart leapt wildly, even as his mind tried to tamp down the treacherous flames of optimism. Could it be that his master had come to speak on his behalf, to assert his innocence in this wretched affair? Surely not even a senator would bother to intervene for the fate of a mere slave. But as Cicero was called forth first to face his accusers, Felix could only watch in terror and awe as Flaccus strode to his defense, his voice booming out over the bloodthirsty crowd. With fiery oratory and impassioned eloquence, the senator laid out a case for Cicero's innocence, revealing the depths of a political conspiracy aimed at sullying the ex-consul's name and removing a formidable opponent. As he listened in stupefaction, Felix began to realize the true contents of the message he had carried. Not evidence of Cicero's guilt, but proof of his master's secret alliance with the beleaguered statesman and a plot to thwart the schemes of their shared enemies. In his naive confusion, the young slave had nearly delivered both great men into the hands of those who sought their destruction. Flaccus gestured back to Felix, still standing manacled and forlorn between his guards. "This loyal slave acted only as my messenger," the senator declared. "He is guilty of no crime, save that of obedience to his master. I will not see him condemned for my intrigues." At his words, Felix felt a surging wave of gratitude and relief, even as bitter shame scorched his cheeks. How could he ever repay the senator's unexpected intercession on his behalf? He owed Flaccus. The stinging crack of the whip echoed through the vineyard, its cruel melody driving the weary slaves to pick faster under the sweltering Tuscan sun. For these wretched souls, There was no respite or escape from the endless drudgery that stretched from dawn until dusk. Their world had narrowed to an infinite expanse of ripening grapes waiting to be plucked by raw, bleeding fingers. At the edge of the vineyard crouched Delos, his back bent under the weight of a woven basket brimming with fruit. With each labored step, the blisters on his feet rubbed painfully against the rope sandals he hadn't removed in days. The other slaves moved mechanically around him, their faces blank, as if their minds had detached from their aching bodies as a merciful release. Only a month before, Delos had been a simple herdsman tending goats in the mountains of Thrace. Then the legions had come, burning his village and slaughtering all who resisted. In the blink of an eye, he'd been reduced from a free man to a piece of property, sold at auction to his new Roman master. Now he was just another nameless laborer, toiling on one of the endless latifundia, the massive slave-worked estates that churned out the agricultural plenty that kept Rome fed. There were thousands of these plantations dotting the Italian countryside, some sprawling across hundreds of square miles. Aristocratic Romans would escape the bustle and filth of the city to relax at their country villas, oblivious to the army of faceless slaves that pruned their orchards, pressed their oil, and stomped their grapes. The latifundia ran on economies of scale, squeezing profits by working slaves to the bone while feeding and clothing them as cheaply as possible. Delos couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten anything but tasteless barley porridge and stale, mouldy bread crawling with weevils. He'd quickly learned to choke it down without complaint. The one thing Delos feared more than endless labor was displeasing the farm's villicus, the slave overseer charged with maintaining discipline and productivity by any means necessary. He was a hulking mountain of a Gaul, his bearded face crisscrossed with scars from the arena. Supposedly, he had killed over 100 men as a gladiator before being sold here to manage the vineyards with the same hardened brutality. The villicus seemed to take sadistic pleasure in devising new punishments for disobedient slaves. When an elderly man had collapsed from heat exhaustion, unable to rise, the villicus had lashed him to a stake in the field, smearing his face with honey. The half-delirious wretch had screamed for hours as flies and wasps descended to feast on his eyes and lips. Delos still remembered the man's hideous shrieks, slowly fading into choked gurgles as his tongue swelled up. Other slaves who had earned the villicus's wrath were locked in chains in the fields at night, exposed to the elements. The lucky ones died quickly of exposure. The rest eventually succumbed to festering wounds from their shackles or throats torn out by feral dogs. The overseer always left their picked-over remains hanging in the fields for a few days as a grim warning. So Delos kept his head down and tried to avoid attracting attention, knowing he could be crippled or killed on a whim. The work itself might end up killing him first. Scratches from the vine's thorny tendrils turned angry and septic with infection. His bare arms were pocked with pustules from the sap's caustic burns. Many of his fellow slaves were walking skeletons, their legs swollen with edema, bellies distended from gnawing hunger. When they dropped dead in the fields, the overseers would casually order them tossed in an unmarked ditch, then ride to the market to purchase fresh replacements. In death, as in life, the master had extracted every last iota of value from their wasted bodies. As the shadows lengthened and the light mellowed to a gamboge glow, the villicus stalked down the rows, roughly grabbing baskets from each slave to weigh their contents. Any shortfalls would be made up with lashes. Delos held his breath as the overseer upended his basket onto the rusted scale, exhaling as it settled a hair's breadth above the required weight. "Adequate," the villicus grunted, dumping the grapes into a cart and shoving the empty basket back into Delos's arms. "These vines better be finished by tomorrow or they'll be hell to pay." Delos nodded mutely, his tongue cleaved to the roof of his cotton-dry mouth. He waited until the villicus had stomped out of earshot to let out a shuddering sigh. He had survived another back-breaking day by the narrowest of margins. There would be no respite, though. The stone cells of the ergastulum awaited, where his aching muscles would twitch against the cold floor until it was time to rise and relive this hellish drudgery anew. As orange streaks finger-painted the violet sky, Delos gazed out over the patchwork fields and tried to recall his past life as a free man. The memories came only in fleeting snatches now, fading a little more each day. His mind was slowly erasing itself, dulling the pain of loss and longing. He wondered how long it would be before his sense of self winked out altogether, leaving him a hollow shell plodding through the motions of slavery. Perhaps that was a blessing granted to those enslaved too long, the mercy of forgetting you were ever anything more than a beast of burden. But some ineradicable shard of defiance still glowed within Delos like a dying ember. He clung to visions of his lost village, his butchered parents, the younger sister dragged off screaming to be sold. They fueled the secret hatred smouldering in his marrow. One day, maybe he would have a chance to fan that ember to a conflagration, to loose that pent-up fury on his masters, the fat, perfumed senators who glided through their seaside villas, quaffing wine pressed by broken slaves, who lounged in baths of Numidian marble, steam billowing from hypercausts stoked by wretches chained in the dark. But until then, there were grapes to pick and lashes to avoid. Another day of slavery to be endured, and so Delos turned his cracked, bleeding feet back toward the ergastulum, the weight of servitude pressing him into the earth. Gnaeus Flavius Aelianus loved nothing more than holding court at his sprawling Tuscan estate. The grizzled senator would recline on an elegant lectus, idly popping grapes into his mouth as he regaled his guests with humble brags about his glittering political exploits. Around him, an array of Rome's rich and powerful guffawed on cue, quaffing goblets of his finest Falernian vintage. "I tell you, re-election is almost more trouble than it's worth," Aelianus chortled, pausing for his audience to stroke his ego with protests. "The bribes alone cost a fortune. Voters' palms seem to be perennially greased these days. I had to open a second Spanish silver mine just to keep up." A flutter of forced laughter dutifully rippled around the colonnade. The sycophants ringing Aelianus's dining couch were all too eager to ingratiate themselves with one of the most powerful men in the Senate. They marveled at the understated opulence of his country villa, a soothing contrast to the clamor of Rome. Aelianus clapped his hands and a train of slaves materialized, bearing platters laden with delicacies plundered from every corner of the Republic. There were shellfish from the waters of Britannia, stuffed dormice from Gaul, spices and pepper from the markets of Antioch, all procured at lavish expense and rushed to the villa by fast horses and ships. "I hope you brought your appetites, my friends," Aelianus said with a grandiose sweep of his arm. "I've had 1,000 thrushes' tongues brought in packed with snow from the Alps, the only way to truly savour their delicate flavour. The gods forbid our elevated tastes should be offended by a hint of spoilage." Applause and appreciative murmurs arose from the gaggle of Epicureans as they beheld the artfully assembled gustatory excess. Aelianus snapped a finger, and a willowy slave boy rushed forth to fill his cup from a bejeweled decanter. The senator took a slow sip, swishing the heady elixir across his discerning palate. "An excellent cacuban," he pronounced, "though perhaps a bit too dry for my tastes. But one can't expect better from vines tended by Thracian hands." He cut a meaningful glance to the figure lurking behind his couch. It was the villicus of his vineyards, standing stiffly with eyes lowered. "Apologies, Dominus," the overseer said, his voice tight with obsequity. "I will have the slaves use a lighter touch when stemming the grapes." "See that you do," Aelianus said coldly. "I didn't install you as villicus to offer excuses. If I detect the slightest hint of slipping quality, you'll be back to fighting for your life in the arena. Only this time without a sword." The overseer blanched, bowing his head lower. "It will be as you wish, Dominus." Aelianus stared at him for a long, unblinking moment before his craggy face broke into a jovial smile. He turned back to his guests, holding out his cup for an attentive slave to refill. "My dear friends, let us turn to more convivial matters. I'm eager to hear the latest delicious gossip wafting through the forum. Regale me with tales of which esteemed senators are secretly taking it Greek style from their slave boys." As the snickers and innuendo began to flow, Aelianus settled back into the plush cushions of his dining couch. This was the life, the just deserts of a man born to rule. To be a senator was to sit at the pinnacle of civilization, surveying the lesser orders from an unassailable perch. It was only right that countless slaves should toil in misery to support the lives of their betters. What were a few suffering servants compared to a man of Aelianus's status and accomplishments? Why the Republic itself would topple without the tireless labor of the enslaved masses? Aelianus glanced at the battalion of slaves ringing the colonnade, standing silent and head-bowed in their rough tunics. Each one was a mere cog in the elaborate apparatus of his entitlement, no more worthy of notice than the beasts that turned the millstones. He rarely thought of them at all, except to bark an order or dole out a beating. And why should he? A slave's purpose was to serve, to sublimate their wants and needs to those of the master. That was the immutable order that kept the Roman world turning. Without it, society would surely descend into anarchy and sloth. Yet as he pivoted his gaze across that sea of downcast faces, Aelianus could have sworn one pair of eyes had flashed to his, just for an instant before darting away. But in that split second he saw something that made his wine sit uneasily in his gut. Something jagged and feral, like the eyes of an animal tensed to lunge for the throat. The moment passed, and Aelianus shook off the unsettling sensation, taking a long draught of cacuban. He had 1,000 more important things to ponder than the imagined impudence of slaves. And yet, for the rest of the night, an almost imperceptible itch of disquiet lingered at the edges of his awareness. Even he couldn't say why, but Aelianus suddenly regretted letting the gladiator-turned-villicus discipline the field hands however he wished. Perhaps it would be wise to rein in some of the brutality on his estate, lest it breed dangerous resentments. He resolved to have his son increase security on their next visit, just in case. Yes, it was always prudent for a man of power to watch his back, because you never knew when the lowliest slave might one day find the courage to bare his fangs. The rhythmic clacking of the loom battens reverberated through the warm, close air of the gynoeceum. Dozens of slave women hunched over their handiwork, stooped backs protruding from drab tunics as they passed shuttles and picks back and forth with deft, weary fingers. Amidst this tableau of resignation and servitude, 2 women kept their heads slightly raised, eyes fixed not on their spindles, but on some distant point beyond these stifling walls. Syphax and Hasdrubal were sisters, Numidian princesses captured after their father's failed rebellion against Rome. Where once their days had been filled with riding bareback across swaying grasslands, now they were yoked to the tedium of turning wool to thread. The sisters' regal bearing and swarthy beauty had not gone unnoticed by their new masters. They had quickly been given the choicest tasks, set to spinning and dyeing rather than scrubbing and scouring. Their hair was allowed to tumble in inky cascades over their shoulders instead of being shorn to bristles. Each wore the hint of kohl around her eyes, a forbidden cosmetic luxury. It was obvious why. Their masters wanted to keep them pretty enough to grace their beds. Since being dragged in chains to this place, Syphax and Hasdrubal had been forced to endure the nightly indignity of serving as concubines to the men who had slaughtered their people. Yet even as their bodies were violated and defiled, the sisters refused to let their spirits be broken. With each thrust and groan of their grunting defilers, they would retreat inward, steeling themselves with dreams of vengeance. Every night, as rough hands groped their flesh, they sank deeper into fantasies of the knife, of drawing a blade across a flabby white throat and watching the arterial blood spray. As the lesser slaves cast sidelong looks at the princess's swaying forms, the sisters just smiled enigmatically, lost in visions of burning villas and Roman heads mounted on pikes. They whispered to each other in their native tongue, keeping the ember of defiance aglow beneath a facade of meek obedience. One day they would shatter these chains. They would show their captors that a slave's hate only grows hotter and keener with the slow passage of enslaved years. But until then, there was wool to card and thread to dye, another shift of drudgery to be borne in mute forbearance. And so Syphax and Hasdrubal turned back to their spindles, faces schooled into masks of blank resignation. Their masters watched from the atrium, chuckling lecherously as they anticipated breaking the wild Numidian fillies yet again tonight. They thought they had tamed the sisters, pounded them into docile submission. Little did they know, buried deep in the flesh they routinely despoiled, the seeds of rebellion were quietly taking root. The streets of Rome teemed with the full spectrum of humanity, from aloof elites gliding by in perfumed litters to gaunt peasants hawking fly-specked wares. But some of the most wretched figures were the ones most easily overlooked, the public slaves scurrying about on the state's business. You could spot them by their close-cropped hair and rough tunics emblazoned with SPQR. Unlike domestic slaves, whose masters at least had a vested interest in keeping them marginally healthy, public slaves were utterly disposable. If one collapsed in the street, their overseers would simply requisition a fresh replacement. There was no task too degrading or dangerous for these chattel of the state. They cleaned public latrines reeking of uric acid and feces. They scraped human grease from the bottom of bathhouse plunge pools, gagging on the stench. They dragged animal carcasses out of the Tiber, bloated and discolored with putrefaction. Most horrifically of all, some public slaves were put to work as executioner's assistants in the arenas and on the Gemonian stairs. They would cart off headless corpses or scoop entrails back into the slashed bellies of vivisected wretches. The lucky ones got to process those killed with a single sword stroke. The unlucky dealt with what remained of those crucified, burned or drawn and quartered. These slaves scuttled through the city like cockroaches, reviled and ignored by all. Their tunics were perpetually crusted with blood, shit and pus, the fluids of Rome's vilest tasks. They dared not meet the eyes of citizens, knowing the revulsion and disdain they would find there. It wasn't uncommon for a public slave to take their own life, rather than face another shift of unrelenting abasement. The most popular method was to accidentally slip and fall headfirst into the massive public ovens that heated the Caldaria. No one would mourn another state-owned drudge. 10 more would be there to scrape their charred remains out with the rest of the ashes. But some public slaves harbored more potent dreams than a swift end to their torment, as their hands mechanically mopped viscera and mucker. As we've seen, the lot of a Roman slave was a bleak and often brutal existence. From sunup to sundown, their lives revolved around unceasing toil and servitude to their masters. They were stripped of their autonomy, their agency, even their basic humanity, viewed as little more than living tools to be used and discarded at their owner's whim. But amid this landscape of exploitation and cruelty, there are remarkable stories of individual slaves who managed to rise above their circumstances. Through ingenuity, perseverance, and sheer force of will, they forged a glimmer of hope in an otherwise hopeless existence. Perhaps no tale better encapsulates this than that of Epictetus, one of Rome's most renowned Stoic philosophers. Born a slave in the 1st century AD, Epictetus spent his youth in servitude to a brutal master named Epaphroditus. As a secretary in his master's household, young Epictetus would have been at constant beck and call, his days filled with endless dictation, correspondence, and clerical drudgery. Yet even in bondage, his keen mind and curiosity shone through. Epaphroditus, himself a former slave who had earned his freedom, recognized Epictetus's intellectual gifts. In a rare act of generosity, he allowed the young man to study philosophy under the Stoic master Musonius Rufus. It was a fortuitous turn of events that would shape the course of Epictetus's life and cement his place in history. Stoicism, with its emphasis on virtue, reason, and self-mastery, held a natural appeal for a brilliant young slave. Its teachings provided a framework for rising above suffering and external circumstances, for maintaining dignity and purpose even in the face of oppression. Epictetus threw himself into his studies, devouring the works of Stoic giants like Seneca and Chrysippus. Even as a slave, Epictetus began to build a reputation as a philosopher and teacher. His master, Epaphroditus, would rent him out to wealthy Romans to lecture on Stoicism. Epictetus used these opportunities to expound on ideas of freedom, morality, and the examined life, subversive notions for a slave to spread amongst the Roman elite. At last, sometime around 68 AD, Epictetus gained his freedom under the reforms of Emperor Nero. Now a freedman, he continued teaching and attracted a devoted band of students. But in 93 AD, the tyrannical Emperor Domitian banished all philosophers from Rome. Epictetus fled to Greece, where he founded a school and spent the rest of his days teaching and writing. Though Epictetus himself wrote nothing, his student Arrian compiled his teachings into a series of discourses and the famed Enchiridion, or Handbook. These works would make Epictetus one of the most influential philosophers of antiquity and a cornerstone of Stoic thought. For a man who spent much of his life as chattel property, Epictetus's impact is nothing short of extraordinary. His teachings on the primacy of virtue, the value of reason, and the indomitability of the human spirit still resonate today. Epictetus showed that true freedom is an internal state, that no external chains can shackle the mind. No man is free who is not master of himself, he taught. In many ways, the slave-turned-philosopher embodied the highest aspirations of Stoic thought. He met adversity with resilience, oppression with virtue, and persecution with an imperturbable calm. "What ought one to say, then, as each hardship comes?" he wrote. "I was practicing for this, I was training for this." Epictetus' remarkable life is testament to the indomitable strength of the human spirit. To rise from brutal servitude to become one of Rome's great moral authorities. That is a story for the ages. His example gave hope to the downtrodden and purpose to countless generations seeking meaning in a chaotic world. Yet for all his monumental accomplishments, Epictetus never forgot his roots as a slave. He likened his former oppression to a donkey's burden, a load that must either be borne or cast off. In his teachings, he exhorted masters to treat their slaves with fairness and kindness. "Slavery is the name of a circumstance, not of a person's worth," he proclaimed. It's tempting to hold up Epictetus as a triumphant figure who transcended slavery to achieve greatness, but to do so risks overlooking the brutal realities faced by millions of Roman slaves who never escaped their bonds. Epictetus was the rarest of exceptions in a society built on entrenched and remorseless servitude. The fact remains that the vast majority of Rome's slaves lived and died in wretched obscurity, their suffering lost to history. For every Epictetus, there were tens of thousands of nameless drudges who slaved away in fields, mines, factories, and households until death or infirmity claimed them. Their stories may be lost, but their lives were no less significant. As we reflect on the legacy of Roman slavery, it's important to recognize both the exceptional individuals like Epictetus and the faceless multitudes they left behind. Together, Their stories paint a complex portrait of resilience and subjugation, of the heights of the human spirit and the depths of human cruelty. In the end, perhaps the true lesson lies somewhere in between, in recognizing the dignity and worth of every human being, regardless of their station. Epictetus himself put it best. Remember that you are an actor in a drama of such a kind as the author pleases to make it, if short of a short one, if long of a long one. If it is his pleasure, you should act a poor man, a cripple, a governor, or a private person. See that you act it naturally, for this is your business. To act well the character assigned you, to choose it is another's. The Roman slave may have been assigned a wretched role, but their struggle was no less dignified. Their oppression was not ordained by nature, as the Romans believed, but imposed by the cruel hand of their fellow man. In the face of such injustice, even small acts of defiance, of kindness, of learning, of simple survival shine like beacons in the darkness. So let us remember the Roman slave, not only the heroic few, but the forgotten many. Let us honor their struggles and draw strength from their example. And let us recommit ourselves to building a world where the dignity of every human being is cherished as an inalienable right. For in the end, we are all assigned a role in this great drama of life, and it is up to us to act it naturally and well. The lonely, tortured lives of slaves condemned to toil in the mines and quarries of Rome is a harrowing yet often overlooked chapter of this brutal institution. Far from the bustling streets of the eternal city, thousands of wretched souls were banished to a dark, confined underworld, where they labored in abject misery until their deaths. These subterranean hellscapes were like gaping wounds cut deep into Italy's picturesque countryside. The most notorious was the Lautumiae prison in Syracuse, a sprawling network of tunnels and galleries gouged out of bedrock to harvest precious limestone. Here, as many as 7,000 slaves at a time were crammed into dank, suffocating pits, their lungs choked with stone dust. From dawn until dusk, they swung pickaxes and hauled boulders, their slick skin glistening in the flickering lamplight. Many were war captives and condemned criminals, but others were slaves sold off as punishment by their masters. All were quite literally worked to death, their broken bodies unceremoniously dumped into mass graves. So noxious were the conditions that even the Roman Senate once debated a proposal, ultimately rejected, to at least clothe the nakedness of these mine slaves, if only to make their appearance less offensive. But it wasn't just the slow asphyxiation, the unrelenting darkness, or the whip cracks of sadistic overseers that made this fate so excruciating. It was the agonizing solitude. To be banished to the mines was to be cut off from all human companionship and comfort. No family, no friends, no reprieve, however brief, from backbreaking drudgery. These isolated slaves must have felt entombed in despair, hidden away from the world above, and soon forgotten entirely. Worse still were the unfortunate slaves sent to the cinnabar mines of Spain, where they were slowly poisoned, extracting mercury for Roman cosmetics. Pliny the Elder tells us their sentences were carefully calculated. As long as they can survive the poisonous fumes, their punishment continues. The taint of mercury eroded their minds and twisted their bodies until they perished in drooling insanity. But perhaps saddest of all were the child slaves born into this lightless void, who never even glimpsed the sun or breathed fresh air. The Christian Saint Perpetua recounts seeing two such piteous young boys as she and her fellow martyrs awaited death in a Carthaginian prison. Filthy and emaciated, the children explained that they'd been snatched from their mother's arms at birth and cast into the mines, where they'd languished ever since. In a perverse irony, the refined marble that adorned Rome's gleaming temples and pampered elites' luxurious villas was chiseled by these faceless spectres wasting away in the underworld. The slaves who quarried, cut, and polished these exquisite stones were not even granted the small dignity of setting foot in the glorious edifices they died to build. Consider the tale of Dorus, an elderly Greek slave consigned to the pitch-black tunnels of a Roman clay mine. In a letter found preserved on a pottery shard, he laments to his former master Aescrion, "I beg you by the gods, as I begged you before. If you are willing to do this, master, please send me a blanket. I beg you, because I am suffering badly from cold as well as starving. The clay is very deep, and the gallery is quite airless." Dorus's desperate plea, scrawled on a scrap in some suffocating mine shaft, is a rare first-hand glimpse into the bleak loneliness and despair of life as a Roman mine slave. How many thousands of others here and in quarries across the empire cried out for relief that never came, until death finally brought a grim deliverance. For these most invisible and isolated of slaves, hope was as distant and unfathomable as the unreachable light glimmering faintly at the end of a tunnel. Banished to dwell in the very depths of Hades on earth, they dug their own mass graves in a profound obscurity and anonymity. The forsaken quarry and mine slaves speak to the darkest depths of human bondage and suffering inflicted by Romans on their fellow man. Turning from the subterranean isolation of mine slaves, we emerge back into the sunlight to witness another class of servitude defined by skill and splendor rather than shadows. These were the slave artisans and engineers who applied their brilliance and craftsmanship to constructing Rome's most iconic monuments. The magnificent architecture that has endured as Rome's greatest legacy was designed and erected in large part by enslaved masters and laborers. Take the resplendent Pantheon, that triumph of Roman engineering, renowned for its perfect proportions and majestic dome. Fittingly, for a temple to all the gods, the Pantheon represents a divine synthesis of technical virtuosity, revolutionary use of arches, coffers, and concrete, with transcendent artistry and beauty. Few who marvel at this ancient wonder today would guess that its sublime form was conceived in the mind of a slave. His name was Lucius Coccius Auctus, and though his contributions have been largely lost to history, Auctus was the architectural visionary behind Agrippa's Pantheon. Born a slave in Tralles to Greek parents, Auctus took the surname of his master, Coccaius, after he was freed. But before his manumission, this prodigy of a servile background had already begun designing and overseeing construction of the largest concrete dome ever built. Auctus is but one luminous example of the countless skilled slave laborers who built classical Rome as we picture it. The Colosseum, Trajan's Market, the aqueducts, all marvels brought into being through the genius and sweat of slaves and freedmen, though the emperors claimed the glory. There was Apollodorus of Damascus, the Syrian Greek slave who served as Trajan's chief architect, engineering the emperor's forum, column, and market. Or Heron of Alexandria, an ingenious Greek slave who invented the first steam engine, vending machine, and other mechanical wonders. While slave miners languished in hellish anonymity, these slave savants and artisans labored in a different kind of obscurity, their talents co-opted and identities eclipsed. The hands that measured and plotted, that laid stones and erected scaffolds, that carved reliefs and plastered frescoes, were the hands of slaves. But their masters alone would be enshrined by the munificence of these monuments. This was the grand bargain for so many skilled slaves of Rome: to surrender name and ownership of one's genius in exchange for slightly more civilized treatment. To design resplendent baths for the masses, palatial villas for the elite, and divine sanctuaries for the gods, knowing these sublime creations would be credited to other, freer men. To literally build the towering glory of Rome, yet be dwarfed and concealed by it for eternity. As we've seen, the treatment of slaves in the Roman world was often brutal and dehumanizing, They could be beaten, branded, even tortured, or killed on a whim. Most led lives of endless toil and drudgery, seen as little more than living tools by their masters. But even in this bleak landscape, there were rare glimmers of hope and humanity. Very occasionally, the bond between master and slave could blossom into something approaching genuine affection and care. We see this in the famous story of Marcus Tullius Tiro, the trusted slave of the great orator Cicero. Tiro was an exceptionally gifted slave, educated and refined. He served as Cicero's personal secretary, librarian and confidant. His duties included handling Cicero's correspondence, transcribing his speeches, and even writing some works published under Cicero's name. Over decades of devoted service, the two men developed a deep bond. Cicero himself writes of his affection and concern for Tiro when he fell ill. In a remarkable act for a Roman noble, Cicero finally granted Tiro his freedom in 53 BC. It was exceedingly rare for such an educated and valuable slave to be manumitted. In freeing Tiro, Cicero called him not only my slave, but my very dear friend. Tiro would go on to enjoy a successful career as a freedman. He even published books of Cicero's more personal letters and witticisms. We can scarcely imagine the inner emotional world of a Roman slave. But in Tiro's story, perhaps we catch a fleeting glimpse of one slave's humanity peeking through the cracks of an inhuman system. However, we must be cautious not to overstate these sentimental ties. The vast majority of slaves toiled and suffered in obscurity, treated as disposable objects. Even the lucky few who were freed still bore the stain of their former servitude. Freed men and women, while no longer property, occupied a liminal status in Roman society. They were expected to show deference and perform unpaid service for their former masters. They could not hold a political office or marry into the senatorial class. The taint of slavery lingered. But for the select few granted manumission, it was still a treasured deliverance. Ironically, many of the most famous rags to riches stories in Roman lore are those of freedmen who rose to positions of great wealth, privilege, and influence. Take the remarkable tale of Tiberius Claudius Narcissus. Born a slave in the imperial household of Claudius, he quickly distinguished himself through his keen intelligence and administrative savvy. He became the emperor's most trusted advisor, serving essentially as the power behind the throne. At a word from Narcissus, senators and aristocrats could be ruined. Through his close relationship with Claudius, Narcissus amassed a fortune and wielded unprecedented influence for a former slave. He played a key role in the imperial conquest of Britain. Some estimate Narcissus was one of the richest men in the empire. Yet his power and position always rested on the fickle favor of the emperor. When Claudius was allegedly poisoned by his ambitious wife Agrippina, Narcissus's fate was sealed. Agrippina ruthlessly purged her husband's old circle, and Narcissus was driven to suicide in 54 AD. His dizzying story underscores both the heights a talented freedman could reach and the precariousness of their position. Narcissus, like all former slaves, discovered that true acceptance in the highest echelons of Roman society remained elusive. The stories of Tiro and Narcissus offer us tantalizing peeks into the complex inner lives of Roman slaves. They reveal glimmers of hope, agency, even deep bonds of affection in an institution built on the most callous subjugation of human beings. But we must be careful not to sanitize this grim reality. The blunt, uncomfortable truth remains that slavery was utterly ubiquitous and unquestioned in Roman society. These sporadic acts of kindness and social mobility for a fortunate few do not change the underlying brutality and exploitation that defined the system. The lavish villas, gleaming aqueducts and magnificent monuments that still awe us today were all built on the scarred backs of a slave populace. Roman slavery would endure for centuries, even after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Many of its basic tenets and practices would later influence the development of serfdom in medieval Europe. Its legacy even shaped the evolution of the brutal African slave trades and colonial plantation slavery of more recent centuries. When we marvel at the splendors of ancient Rome, it is crucial that we also grapple with the human suffering that made it all possible. The forgotten stories and voices of Roman slaves may be largely lost to history, silenced by their lack of power and literacy. But in striving to understand their plight, we begin to acknowledge their incalculable contributions and recognize their fundamental humanity. We cannot change the past, but we can work to build a future in which such exploitation is unimaginable. In interrogating this ancient institution, we catch glimpses of our own potential for both callousness and compassion. As we ponder what Rome might say about the human cost of its glory, perhaps we also hold up a distant mirror to our own conflicted modern world. The Roman Empire and its prodigious feats still dazzle us thousands of years later, but the dark engine of slavery that powered it all is an inescapable part of that legacy. In listening closely, we may faintly hear the echoes of those unnamed millions, whose blood, sweat, and tears watered the roots of Western civilization itself. So the next time you gaze in wonder upon the Pantheon or the Colosseum, spare a thought for the faceless, enslaved multitudes who toiled to raise them stone by backbreaking stone. Theirs is a story still being unearthed, and one that deserves to be told. Thank you so much for listening to this extended exploration of slavery in ancient Rome. I hope you found it an illuminating journey, even if not always a comfortable one. If you'd like to learn more about the stark realities faced by Roman slaves, I'd encourage you to check out some of the resources in the description below. And if you've enjoyed this deep dive into the social history of the ancient world, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. I'm always striving to create content that's both informative and thought-provoking. But for now, I think we all could use a well-earned rest. So thanks again for joining me on this journey to the distant past. And until next time, sweet dreams.